can say it's French. You can say, you know what I'm saying? Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We should probably get started because we have a tight schedule today. I know everybody in the room, but anyway, I'll do this for formality's sake. I'm Darnell Hunt, Director of the Bunch Center for African American Studies, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today Juan Williams. Mr. Williams, of course, will be our featured speaker tonight at the Thurgood Marshall Lecture and Dinner. And as you know, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. And of course, this book about Thurgood Marshall is what we're here to hear about today. And it's quite apropos that we have a man who's written this very informative, insightful biography of Thurgood Marshall. Juan Williams is one of America's leading political writers and thinkers. He is the senior correspondent for NPR and the political analyst for Fox Television. A former prize-winning columnist and editorial for the writer for the Washington Post, he has also authored 3 books. His most recent is entitled This Far by Faith, and is the story of the African American religious experience. Previous books include the nonfiction bestseller Eyes on the Prize, a book that I remember quite well from many years ago. It was quite informative again about the civil rights movement, and the critically acclaimed biography Thurgood Marshall, American Revolutionary. Time magazine described American Revolutionary as a magisterial work of American history, and this book was reissued this year with a new epilogue to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Supreme Court's Brown decision. Williams' understanding of American history and his inside access to Washington politics gives him a unique and informed voice as an analyst of current events. In 2000, NPR selected him to host their afternoon talk show, Talk of the Nation. And in the 2 years, Williams brought the show's ratings to record heights. His daring perspectives are based on his historical understanding, political expertise, and knowledge of diversity. Prior to writing bestsellers, Williams was a political analyst and national correspondent for the Washington Post. In a 21-year career at the Post, he served as an editorial writer, an op-ed columnist, and White House reporter. He won several journalism awards for his writing and investigative reporting. He also won an Emmy Award for TV documentary writing. He was given widespread critical acclaim for a series of documentaries, including Politics, The New Black Power. His documentary on A. Philip Randolph was featured on PBS. This year, as I remarked previously, is the 50th anniversary of the Brown decision, and it coincides with the nation taking a renewed interest in the issues of racial equality and the unique role of the growing Hispanic population. Because of Williams' expertise, the President's Commission chose him as the keynote speaker at the Smithsonian Museum in 2003 to commemorate the Brown anniversary. Williams was also selected as the first speaker in 2003 for C-SPAN's nationally televised series, Students and Leaders. As senior correspondent for NPR's Morning Edition and host of America's Black Forum, a nationally syndicated weekly news program, Williams is at the cutting edge of American culture and politics. Juan Williams.
Thanks very much. We have a real opportunity, I think, here to have an intimate conversation because of the size of this audience, to really talk about the legacy of former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. I must say that in this size audience, it's a treat for me because I really get to hear people and what they think, and so I hope that this will be sort of a highly interactive session. But I thought I would start off by telling you that when I think about the execution of that book, I'm sort of amazed that it ever came to be because Justice Marshall was such a reclusive figure and such a difficult person to get to know. I don't think he would have ever accepted Mr. Hunt's invitation to come out here for even the 15th anniversary Thurgood Marshall Lecture. That just wasn't Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was the kind of guy that you met him in Washington and you went to shake hands with him, he might turn away from you. As he once said to me, it's one handshake for them, it's 1,000 for me, and I've got to eat a sandwich. So he wasn't and that was Thurgood Marshall. He could be rough, he could be cantankerous. He was a guy who, when President Carter made some efforts to get him to think about possibly stepping down so he could appoint another African American to the Supreme Court, Carter, if you remember, never had an appointment to the Supreme Court. Marshall reacted as if someone had personally insulted him. The idea being that, I have enough to put up with the conservatives on this court and in the world, and why should I have to put up with the idea that a liberal Democrat in the White House will be trying to end my term, my lifetime appointment to the Supreme Court. This was Thurgood Marshall. That's the reality of the man. And I must say, circumstances and people, both on the court, in the media, in Washington in general, didn't help his predisposition. I remember when one of my former colleagues, probably my most famous former colleague, who's just got a new book out, Bob Woodward, the famous investigative reporter, did a book about the Supreme Court back in the late 70s. Some of you may recall the book was called The Brethren. And that book, Justice Marshall comes across as something of a joke, someone who's not of the intellectual caliber to truly sit on the highest court in the land, someone who is watching afternoon soap operas, coming in late, leaving early, someone who's making jokes about the pornographic films that the justices have to watch for their obscenity cases. And these jokes are getting all around the courthouse because the clerks, the young people, would repeat them to others. And so the image of Justice Marshall in this book was of someone who might have been put on the court as a token gesture by President Johnson in the midst of all the racial turmoil that attended the 1960s. Marshall had a different view of himself. He saw himself as someone who was on the court, struggling to represent people who had never had a voice at that high level of American life. He saw himself, today we think of the court, we can think of a black man on the court, we can think of two women on the court. At that point, Thurgood Marshall was the be-all and end-all in terms of minority representation on the court. And if you recollect, he had been active in everything from protecting First Amendment rights in the Pentagon Papers case to going forward. Just this last weekend, we saw the big turnout in Washington for the Women's March. Of course, he was active in Roe v. Wade, played a critical role in. And of course, on Bakke, another critical case. There's Thurgood Marshall. And in fact, even in a defeat, getting Justice Powell to write in that race was a legitimate consideration as a factor for admissions into a college or university, a factor then written into the majority decision by Justice Powell, and played such a key role last year when you saw Justice O'Connor in her decision, base her decision largely on that one sentence in Justice Powell's words, literally coming out of Thurgood Marshall's mouth. So in all these ways, during the course of the 70s, Marshall saw himself playing a critical role. I could go further because one of my things, and I know that the Bunch Center is involved with the Prison Outreach Project, there was Marshall fighting against the use of the death penalty for a time because of the disparate impact of sentencing sentences in this country in terms of black and white, and stopping the use of the death penalty on that basis for a time. So what you see is Thurgood Marshall, literally, if you looked at the work of the court over that decade, playing this critical role. But in the one-year period that Bob Woodward looked at, 78, 79, he saw Marshall as really not in the mix and somewhat of a joke. And of course, the sad part of it is Marshall had been sick during that period. He'd suffered a case of pneumonia that almost killed him. He'd been in a car crash, had some broken bones. He was struggling to stay in the game, and then he, of course, was struggling with President Carter towards the end of that period. And there comes this book that portrays him in this negative light. And for Marshall, what it did was it confirmed in him his sense that people don't understand me, people don't appreciate me, people will never celebrate me in the way that is justifiable. And I think, let me just say that being here at the Bunch Center reminds me in part of the way that times and attitudes shift with regard to our heroes. And when you think of Marshall from the perspective of people who had been involved in the civil rights movement during the 60s, young people who had been the activists, the people who were involved in mass movement, people who were going south for Freedom Summer, taking part in Freedom Rides to integrate America's buses as they traveled from state to state, people who were involved even in things like the Great March on Washington in '63. From their perspective, the NAACP and the NAACP as personified by Thurgood Marshall was old hat. It was stuck in the mud. It was the progressive movement of people who believed in making arguments in a courthouse before a judge, before a jury, and hoping that the establishment would respond to your briefs, to your legal briefs, to your pleas, rather than using yourself, daring to risk your body, risk your well-being, risk your job in some cases, to go out there and foment social change through mass protest. And people came to honor mass protest and, in a sense, put down the work that had been done by Marshall. Now, I must say, from Marshall's perspective, so much of that was short-sighted. Marshall used to say that he worried about these young people who like to go out, get themselves arrested, put themselves into jails that were controlled by Southern sheriffs, by the likes of Bull Connors. Bull Connor, who would, of course, use his powerful fire hoses to blast young people, use those terrible dogs to attack protest marchers and all the like. Marshall was someone who would shy away from it. In Marshall's mind, if you saw Dr. King at his most glorious moment standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial delivering this I Have a Dream speech, and you were moved to tears, and you had a clearer sense of what the dream might be for all Americans, and then went home that night to a segregated neighborhood, to limited educational opportunities for your children, to limited economic opportunities, limited job opportunities, Marshall would ask, well, what changed? What's the real payoff for what took place there? It might be emotional, but it certainly isn't concrete in terms of long-lasting value to you, to your children, and to future generations in terms of racial equality or racial opportunity. So from Marshall's perspective, there was a real clash between the way that he viewed progress taking place and the way that the younger generation of that era viewed progress. And I say that because there was an earlier talk with Darnell about the way that people remember Ralph Bunche and remember, forget at times the different phases of Ralph Bunche's life and moments in which he represented a sort of more rebellious streak in terms of African American thought, and other times when he was quite in line with the establishment as a Nobel Prize winner as a diplomat. Well, to come back to Marshall, Marshall felt then that that younger generation of African American activists had largely forgotten him. And I must say, although I was never an activist, I had forgotten him as a journalist because I saw him as kind of an overweight man in the thick black cloaks of a Supreme Court justice sitting on that court. I did not see him as a key figure in terms of someone who was creating social history in this country. My sense was, oh, you know, that's Thurgood Marshall, you know, some president put him up there, you know, and what does he do, kind of thing. I was much more taken by the drama. Obviously, I think most people are taken by the drama of Dr. King or Malcolm X, people who literally died as martyrs, having shed blood and given their life, given their everything to the cause. And there's Thurgood Marshall living to a ripe old age, certainly not contributing to any sort of martyrdom for his name. So what you had was a situation where Marshall retreats almost in total after the Woodward book. He does not feel in sync with the civil rights movement of the day. He's clearly out of touch with the legacy of King and the emergence of Jesse Jackson in terms of Jackson's '84 campaign, and certainly out of touch with the likes of a Louis Farrakhan. He's out of touch increasingly with his own brethren on the Supreme Court, being pushed farther and farther to the left, so much so that he's not working to create the 5-member majorities needed to pass decisions in the court, instead contenting himself sometimes working with Bill Brennan and writing minority opinions, dissenting opinions, that he hopes will be the basis for majority rulings once the court has a different constituency, maybe, you know, a future president who would appoint more liberals to the court. So this is Thurgood Marshall, and at one point he decides that he will talk to someone, because it wasn't as if people weren't trying to reach out to him. I tried to reach out to him when I was doing Eyes on the Prize, and just got nowhere, nothing, not even a response. I had come to understand some of the work that he had done in my initial research for the project, and I was awed by it. I just, again, for me, as I say, coming through that generation and sharing that generational perspective on him, and even my perspective as a journalist in Washington, I just didn't understand. And to realize that if you go back over time and you look at who undid the use of consent decrees in the country, restrictive covenants in the country, you know, that kept people from buying property in the better neighborhoods. If you looked at the reality of who was so critical in terms of establishing and protecting the rights of blacks to serve on juries in the country, you look again, I mean, it just goes on and on in terms of his work in terms of military desegregation by President Truman in '47, and then later working to promote it, even traveling to Southeast Asia to meet with General MacArthur about it. And coming forward, people talk about Dr. King and the Montgomery bus boycott, but of course that's a law case eventually, and settled in the courts. And you look and say, well, who won that case? And you come to the name Thurgood Marshall. So for all these reasons, for me, I was like, oh, well, I can't believe this guy's alive. People don't know who he is, don't understand the contributions that he's made in terms of racial progress in this country. He's almost a forgotten figure, although he's alive. So very much wanted to meet with him. As I said, just got nowhere, got no response, zero. And then I read in the paper, after I had long finished my work on Eyes on the Prize, read in the paper that the black columnist Carl Rowan, who knew Marshall as a friend, they didn't know each other in the kind of adversarial relationship that often exists between journalist and subject, but knew each other as friends because President Johnson had appointed Rowan as ambassador to Finland during the 60s, and of course he appointed Marshall first as Solicitor General and then to the Supreme Court. So they knew each other as fellow appointees of the Johnson administration, and they had a certain social relationship in Washington because there were few black people at that level of Washington life. So they agreed that they are going to work together on a biography of Thurgood Marshall. But literally within days of this agreement, the agreement is broken apart. And then a few weeks later, I read in the paper that they have not only broken apart the agreement, but they've done something that is totally anathema to me as a writer. Marshall sent a check for $100,000 back to a publisher. I'm sure he'd never hear that about me. And said that he didn't want anything to do with any writing. And so, being the curious kind of person I am, I called up Rowan to say, what's up? Why did you guys end this relationship? I thought this was going to be the book. And of course, I had a self-interest. I had hoped that someday I would write the book. Then I thought, well, at least somebody will write the book will come out. And then here it is now, there's not going to be a book. So I make the call, and Rowan explains to me that he wanted to start the book out with a story about how Marshall, a story that would exemplify the kind of difficulties, the hurdles that Marshall had to deal with as a black lawyer in the United States during the 1940s, to really put it in perspective that he was an extraordinary individual, in part because of the terrific degree of difficulty he had to face in simply representing a client. And so the story that he picked was a case that Marshall had lost before the Supreme Court. And the case, I'll tell you briefly about it, involves a man who was accused of a terrible murder in the town of Hugo, Oklahoma. And the man was accused of killing a farm family, the entire family, parents and 3 children, not only killing the people, but then burning the house down in order to hide the crime. So off goes Thurgood Marshall. Now Thurgood Marshall, let me just tell you, was constantly besieged by people, black people all over the country, seeking to have his attention for injustices that they were suffering. And believe me, there was no end to the injustices they suffered. But in this case, a man named Roscoe Dunjee, who was the editor of the Oklahoma Black Dispatch, the major black newspaper, not only in Oklahoma but in that region, and a man who was a member of the NAACP board, made a personal appeal to Marshall to get involved with the case because he said this was an example of the kind of coerced confessions that the police were getting from black people and then using those confessions as the basis for convictions, and people were being unfairly sentenced, and that if Marshall could win this case, it would act as a precedent across the country, so it would attack a larger problem. It was on that basis then that Marshall agrees to come down to Hugo, Oklahoma. It requires train, bus, and once he gets to Oklahoma City, really getting off a bus and getting in the back of a hearse, because that's what people, black people in Oklahoma, felt was necessary to protect Thurgood Marshall, to bring him out from Oklahoma City to Hugo in the back of a hearse so no one would know he was come. They were going to move him around from house to house every night to protect him. All this kind of subterfuge in order to protect lawyer Marshall. So Marshall gets out there, and what he discovers is that the governor is involved with this case because pretty much the police and the community agree that the crime was committed by 2 men, 2 convicts, who had escaped from the state penitentiary just outside of Hugo. But because the governor's running for re-election, the governor decided he couldn't afford the scandal about loose or lax security at the prison. So somehow those two convicts, they're not even put back in jail, but they are sent out of the state. In fact, they are paid, given money sufficient to get out of the state through Texas into Mexico. Never heard from again. And then they identify a mildly retarded black man as the culprit in the case. They take him to a jail cell. And they get him in this jail cell and they beat him up badly. They use all kinds of horrific implements to torture him. They don't give him food. They don't allow him access to a bathroom. They've got a light that they leave on so he cannot sleep. They make noise to keep him awake. And after several days, he still has not confessed to the crime. Then they decide they got to push this because they need to get a conviction in the case. And what they do is at around midnight, they bring in a pan of charred human bones with ashes and fling it in his face. And this man, as I say, mildly retarded, but also highly superstitious, freaks out. Can't deal with it. And begins to scream, you know, whatever you want, I'll do it, whatever you want. And what they want is for him to confess. And he says, okay, whatever you say, I did it. But then, fearing that they didn't have a strong enough confession, they take him out in the middle of the night to the site of this terrible murder, where people had their throats slashed, children had their throats slashed, where bodies were burned in the fire that consumed the farmhouse afterwards. And they push him down into the ashes of these dead people with their bones still there. And then get him to sign a confession to having committed the crime. Marshall goes into court, points out the lack of evidence, the lack of motive, the lack of any witnesses that would put this man in the vicinity of the crime. The fact that he didn't own a knife, didn't even know how to use a knife of that size required for this kind of crime, didn't have any of the money that had been missing after the crime was committed, all the rest. The judge turns his back on Marshall. The jury comes back in about 40 minutes, and Marshall's later told that's how long it took him to smoke the cigars they'd taken back into the jury room. And they come back and sentence the man to death, to a death sentence. So Marshall at first is like, you know, not that upset, kind of expected this, and his thought is, you know what, I'm going to appeal this to the state Supreme Court, and certainly it's going to be overturned there. I think in part his certainty was based on the fact that while he may have lost the case to the jury, I got to tell you, he won the case before the people of this town, an overwhelmingly white town, so much so that the first branch of the NAACP opened by a white person was opened by the father of the woman who was killed in that farm family. He opened a branch of the NAACP in Hugo based on what Thurgood Marshall had done and seeing the injustice being perpetrated against black people in this town. But when the case gets up to the state Supreme Court, the justices affirm the decision. Marshall can't believe it. But he's still not convinced that anything bad is going to happen to his client. Instead, he appeals the case to the Supreme Court of the United States, certain that the evidence here is so thin, that this is such a clear case of a coerced confession, that certainly the court is going to overturn this conviction. Well, when the case gets to the Supreme Court, Marshall makes his arguments. The court comes back with a decision that says that Marshall's right. The first confession was certainly coerced. They shouldn't have thrown those pan of badly charred bones in the man's face. But then they say the second confession is to be allowed to stand because it was a signed confession and done without any coercion. And of course, you know, as I've told you the story, the man was taken out in the middle of the night to the farmhouse and had his face pushed in those ashes, but that's the reality. The man is now to be sent to his death. And Marshall literally cried. I should stop here and tell you that Thurgood Marshall, as a Supreme Court lawyer, not a Supreme Court justice, but as a Supreme Court lawyer, won 27 of the 32 cases he argued before the court. He's literally, I don't know how you want to think of it, whatever frame you might use, let's use baseball, he's literally the Babe Ruth, Barry Bonds, Mark McGuire, Sammy Sosa of Supreme Court lawyers. There's nobody with a better batting average or slugging percentage, however you want to think of it, than Thurgood Marshall to this day. Marshall cried. Marshall stayed in touch with the man's mother, stayed in touch with the man, sent him money. Eventually, the death sentence was transferred to a life sentence. Marshall, though, considered it his worst defeat ever in the Supreme Court of the United States. So here is Rowan now as the biographer, as the writer, seeking to start a book about his life with a defeat, telling the story of how Thurgood Marshall was beaten in the Supreme Court. From Rowan's perspective, this is a dramatization. It's not a dramatization because it's real, but it is a dramatic example of the kind of hurdles that he, as a black lawyer, had to leap in the course of the 1940s to represent his client. But remember what I was telling you earlier about Marshall's thin skin, and about how Marshall felt that the younger generation of activists in the black community didn't honor him, how he felt that the white community disrespected him in terms of the Woodward book, how he felt completely under siege. And now here comes his friend who's going to start a book about him with his cooperation by telling about a defeat. It was too much for Marshall. He couldn't handle it. Too painful. So he breaks off the relationship with Rowan. Rowan goes on to do a book that is more like a memoir about how he knew Marshall, he knew President Roosevelt, he knew Eleanor Roosevelt. It becomes that kind of a thing. But again, what occurred to me as a writer was no one has ever really done a serious work on Thurgood Marshall, paid attention to Marshall, and given him that serious treatment. So you might think to yourself, well, it's kind of like a vulture, but that's all right if you want to think of it that way. But I was like a vulture perched, and began sending notes and letters and making phone calls again to see if Marshall would pay attention and grant me an interview. And just got nothing back, nothing at all. But eventually he did call, and eventually I went up there. And we did interviews pretty much once a week for 6 months, talking about what was his relationship on a very personal basis to the civil rights era that he had lived through. He was born in 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland. He was in every decade of the 20th century. And here's an individual who, just incredible, and from my perspective. I mean, he's in high school with Cab Calloway. He's in college with Langston Hughes. When he first goes to the NAACP, he has an office next to W.E.B. Du Bois. Yeah, I mean, it's just breathtaking if you stop and think about all these people and their interaction. And then you come, of course, during law school, his mentor, the man that really shapes and forms him, is Charles Hamilton Houston, the dean of the Howard University Law School. Just fabulous, fabulous personal history, time and again. I mean, he goes so far back as to talk about grandfathers who fought with the Buffalo Soldiers, another grandfather who fought in the Civil War with the Union Navy. And you see the establishment of a black middle class, more free black people in Baltimore City, both before and after the Civil War than anywhere else in the country, largely a function of the fact that Baltimore was a port city, and so you had a strong black economy where black people were the top sail makers, the caulkers, people who not make the boat but fit the boat. Just an incredible history. Both grandfathers were in the catering business. Sometimes I would make the mistake of saying grocers, and he would stop the interview and correct me quite clearly. These people were caterers to the very finest families in Baltimore City, and therefore making a very strong living. His father had been the maitre d' of sorts out of a country club on the Chesapeake Bay during the summer months, the Gibson Island Country Club. This is a life I think most people don't associate with black people, but yet it existed, and there was political power attached to that economic power in Baltimore, and it produces Marshall and Marshall's family, and that vision, that possibility of integration as an ideal. So early in his mind, of course, that's the ideal that then he begins to work on, to play out, to try to realize in terms of American law. I feel, Darnell, like I've spoken for too long. I'm sorry if I got going, but I promise that this will be interactive, and I invite your questions and comments.
It's very informal, so just feel free to pose some questions if you have them.
Just out of curiosity, was Carter considering any particular person at that time?
Yes, he was. And I'm going to struggle to remember a name right now. But he was a black man who was Solicitor General in Carter's administration from Michigan. And I'm just not going to remember the name because I'll block on it right now. but someone with, this is a wonderful story, someone with pretty much the same mindset in terms of American politics, in terms of African American history, as Thurgood Marshall. But Marshall viewed him as kind of waiting to grab his seat, and therefore came to resent the man. And there's a story, it's told in the book, about there being a celebration at the court for former Solicitor Generals of the United States. And all the Supreme Court justices are in attendance for this event. And I'm so sorry I can't remember this man's name. Anyway, the man was the host for the event as the sitting Solicitor General. And he began to talk about various Solicitor Generals who had done great things during their time. And he kept going and didn't come to Thurgood Marshall's name. Now, Marshall was sitting there and drinking, to be quite honest about it. And as he was not hearing his name called in the ranks of great Solicitor Generals, came to think that he was being passed over by this man who wanted his job. And finally couldn't tolerate it any longer, and stands up, slightly tipsy, knocks over plates and glasses, grabs part of the tablecloth unintentionally and makes an even larger, louder clatter of sound, and leaves. And of course, what was going on was the man was saving Marshall for last, as the pièce de résistance of someone who had been a great Solicitor General and then had risen to become a Supreme Court Justice. But Marshall, as I said in the start of the talk with you, it was so thin-skinned and felt so much like everybody ignored him or thought negatively of him or something that he couldn't take it. And that's what led him into that, created a further embarrassment for him, because then his wife was left to make apologies, and then later when he heard what had happened, he never apologized himself, but it was clear that he felt that he had misbehaved. But I think you have to understand the character he had become at that point in his life.
What's your personal opinion about why he was so thin-skinned? Is it because of the family background and his, ability to see integration based on what his family did, or just an aspect of his personality?
No, as I described to you, I think lots of things contributed to it. First and foremost, I think the younger generation did not honor Marshall. They weren't, even afterwards, we have, a federal holiday, we have for Dr. King's birthday, and all that kind of thing. And Marshall, as I said, from his perspective, he had achieved so much for African Americans, so much in terms of American history, for people even beyond African Americans. And he just felt like, he didn't get his proper due. But I would say also that for Marshall it was a matter of being, I'll give you an example. Even on the court, at one point, there was an appeal made in terms of the bombing of Cambodia. And Justice Douglas wanted to approve an injunction to stop the bombing, to stop Johnson from conducting this bombing. And Marshall was the justice in charge of the Second Circuit, which is New York State, and the complaint was being brought by Elizabeth Holtzman, later a congresswoman from Brooklyn, actually. And Marshall, when he heard that Douglas had approved this without going through him, got together the other justices on a phone conference, reversed it. And so Marshall was viewed as someone who was supporting the Vietnam War, someone who was not in touch with the spirit of the civil rights activist movement of the 60s. And I think Marshall just felt like people didn't understand, treasure him, honor him. And it led him to be this very difficult personality. As I said, and things got worse as you get towards the 70s and the 80s, and he just pulls into himself. Really does.
I had to come a few minutes late, so forgive me if you've already covered this. Did you mention the NAACP legal defense time in terms of earlier and maybe comparatively what it faces today?
No, not at all. Obviously Marshall, I mentioned Marshall Marshall's work, ending the use of restrictive covenants and the like, all the time he was, of course, head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. His work as a lawyer was done as the director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. But tell me more about your question in terms of what they face today.
Could you maybe just compare the defense fund today under its present leadership, like Connie Rice and others? Was it a function of one charismatic figure, i.e. Marshall, or is it something that has gone on to be sustainable vis-a-vis the challenges that African Americans face today?
Well, let's continue to talk about this because, in fact, you know, Marshall's work at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund truly creates a model, not only in terms of its success, but it's a model for how other groups then begin to attack issues of segregation or bias in the society. So you get a Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, a Children's Legal Defense Fund, a Gay Rights Defense Fund, and it goes on and on.
Right.
There's a Women's Defense, all of that. All that is based on the precepts put in place by Marshall, arguing that there are equal rights in the Constitution, there are protections in the Constitution, and therefore the federal government must enforce and protect those rights for the minorities in the society. When you ask me whether or not it was a function of a charismatic personality, I don't think so. Certainly it wasn't Marshall as the charismatic personality, although, you know, given my description of Marshall to you this afternoon, you might think that he was not a popular figure. You'd be interested to know that when Jet magazine was polling people in the late 50s in terms of who was the most celebrated black leader, it wasn't Dr. King, even after Montgomery and after King was stabbed in Harlem, it is Thurgood Marshall still. And Marshall was an effective speaker, the top fundraiser, even more so than Walter White or any of the people who were identified as the leadership of the NAACP. But Marshall was part of this larger movement. I think that's what we lose touch with. That if you really go back and look at the roots of the movement, you know, you understand the Niagara Conference where the NAACP is created, and you understand the emergence of people coming together from different lines, Dr. Du Bois and others, coming together to create this powerful engine of social change. And they are not just working on one area, education. They're across the board looking for ways to break down segregation in American society. They're attacking the use of lynch mobs and the fact that lynching is tolerated in the society, trying to get the Congress to pass anti-lynching legislation. They're involved in politics and trying to change the attitudes of politicians. One of the key victories, I remember in a conversation with Marshall one time saying that I thought Brown was his most stellar victory, and fixing the stare on me and saying, no, it was Smith v. Allwright, and I, in my ignorance, not knowing what Smith v. Allwright was, and then having to like fake it and check it out and find out it was a Texas case where the Democrats in Texas had used, they had said that they were a private club, and as a private club entitled to select their members who would vote in the primaries, and of course the members they selected were all white males. So what you would get is, you would get the Democrats then nominating a white male based on votes by white males, and most often that white male was a segregationist. And that segregationist then would be running against a Republican who would be trying, as they said in those days, to outseg the Democrat, the Dixiecrat, you know. And when those people ended up in Congress or in the Senate, they were never going to support anti-lynching legislation. They were never going to be supporters of the interest of black people, Hispanic people, women, anything but white males. And so part of the work of the NAACP was to get involved with politics, to try to change that system, to try to make American democracy more reflective of the interests and rights of minority citizens. So the NAACP was working on all of these fronts. And then you get a situation where they get a surprise grant, and they use the grant to look at ways in which they could most effectively begin to use the law to attack segregation. And the report that's generated by the money that's given for this study identifies education as that front. Charles Hamilton Houston gets involved, and Houston was quite a dramatic, charismatic figure on his own, quite someone that was highly respected. Had fought in World War I, had gone to Harvard University Law School. His father had been a lawyer in Washington, D.C. So he was a well-known figure and a leader, and he then gets this whole thing going in a sense, creates the law school, Howard University Law School, through reforms of the law school that produces Thurgood Marshall and so many of the other lawyers that are going to play a key role in terms of Brown. And so it's not one man, it's not a charismatic movement, it is the power of a widespread, solidly rooted movement, because the NAACP is getting money from chapters around the country. You know, it's to the point where the NAACP is viewed as such a threat that in some communities in some southern states it's banned, viewed as a communist organization and all the rest. And in fact, that's why Dr. King has to create the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to say, you know, we're Christian-based, we're not putting anything to do with those crazy folks over at the NAACP. But people forget and start to see the NAACP as the old line that's stuck in the mud line. They forget. But so in response to you, you have to see the NAACP as this truly broad-based effort coming along during that period. Now, as compared to today, I would say that young people, especially young people, I think don't feel that connection to the NAACP and that history in the way that it was felt early in the 20th century. I just don't think that exists. And I would add that, you know, it's interesting to me when I talk to people about education and the continuing higher level of segregation in America's schools. And in black communities, you often see people saying, you know, they're just not excited about having the NAACP come in and argue for busing or school desegregation plans. That fever has passed. And so it's a different era with different challenges, but most telling to me as a journalist with different attitudes.
Thank you for coming and sharing glimpses of Marshall's life. Like you said, he is a overlooked, I think, historical figure in terms of knowing the depth of his personal life. My question is about the subtitle, Thurgood Marshall, an American Revolutionary. And, you know, as you think about revolution, you know that it's predicated upon abolishing or eradicating these systems of oppression, you know, whether it's economic, political, or social. And so Marshall chose to eradicate this legalized system of racial discrimination within the established mainstream system that America set up, especially through its courts. And so you then understand the complexity and the nuances of revolution. So in Marshall's work of eradicating kind of the vestiges of racism and sexism, to name a few, which was symbolic of the system, but yet choosing to do his work within the courts, there's this dichotomy. And so I guess I'd like for you to further explain why you chose American Revolutionary within the subtitle of the text. Because, you know, like I said, revolution is often seen as kind of breaking down a system and creating something new. And so even though he broke down the system of racial discrimination, he still did it within, you know, this kind of mainstream system itself.
Well, I guess I wanted to get your attention. I wanted you to ask that question. I wanted to challenge the way you think about revolution. And also, I think, to help people come in touch with the idea that if you were alive when Marshall was born in 1908, living under Plessy v. Ferguson, the separate but equal ruling of 1896, and living in America where lynching was, I'm not trying to be overly dramatic, but it was not uncommon, let's just put it like that. And where the indignities of living as a black person are legend to this day. The idea that you could overturn Plessy, literally overturn to the point where the federal government would no longer be about enforcing the laws of separate but equal, the laws of segregation, allowing things like attacks on black people, you know, burning down their towns, all the rest of their businesses to take place, is a revolutionary act in and of itself. So from the time he's born to 54, when you get Brown, I think that that's a revolutionary accomplishment to overturn, as you said, revolution may be defined as overturning an economic or political structure. I think we did both, or Thurgood Marshall and other places, we did both by overturning separate but equal. Because I think separate but equal was that powerful, that accepted in the politics and the culture of the country at that time, and Brown overturned it. But I might add that I would go on, and I think to say that I think Marshall, as a judge, as a Solicitor General, and then as a Supreme Court Justice, continues to help foment that change. If you think about even the legacy of Brown, something I'm going to talk about tonight, I think Brown is really the starting point for so much of the modern civil rights era. That if you think about the use of mass movement and mass protest and nonviolent social resistance, I think much of that starts at the moment, May 17, 1954, when Brown becomes law, because people then have a heightened level of expectation as to what is possible in American life. And so you get more attention from the media on, let's say, the Montgomery bus boycott. There have been bus boycotts before. But now this one becomes front page, center of attention. Dr. King rises to become a national figure. You get situations like the president using the military, the 101st Airborne, to defend the rights of the 9 black kids in Arkansas at Central High School. That's a revolutionary activity. You have got the federal government from being your enemy now to, I don't know about being your friend, but certainly enforcing your rights under the law. That's a radical shift. I think we tend to have such a limited definition of radical and revolutionary that sometimes we skip the people who are truly making the changes. And I think Marshall was someone who truly made a change in American life. That's why I use that title, other than wanting to get your attention.
You talked quite a bit about Thurgood Marshall's connection to the NAACP and also about changing attitudes toward the NAACP. And I think for my generation, a lot of people in my generation have difficulty really seeing the NAACP as an organization that is connected to the larger black community in terms of some of the very real issues, newer issues affecting the black community across socioeconomic backgrounds, sort of not as present in the organization as it may have been. And so I'm wondering if you could, and you've already spoken to it quite a bit, but maybe discuss for us some of the more cogent connections between sort of our vision of the NAACP, perhaps today in 2004, and the very real connection between our vision of Thurgood Marshall or any other persons from that era who were connected with the NAACP.
Well, I think what you have to remember when you think about the NAACP today, I was just having a conversation with some people in the Bush administration who are angry at the NAACP this moment over the use of ads in the 2000 campaign when they had ads, with elements of James Byrd attack in Texas, and they used it. The NAACP used those ads, and I think it's one of Byrd's sisters appears in the ad saying that then Governor Bush of Texas would not approve hate crime legislation that would have given prosecutors even more tools with which to go after the three white men who committed that terrible crime. And then, of course, Bush's position was you don't want to give prosecutors such extraordinary latitude because you don't know when they'll turn it on you. And, how do you determine what's in a person's heart? If I kill you, I certainly killed you. It might not matter if I killed you because of the color of your skin or your sex or anything else. I killed you. So it was an argument over that. But the way the NAACP played it was like Bush supports lynching. And they did it effectively. It stirred black turnout nationally, if you recall that 2000 race. And not only that, I think it demonized Bush in the black community. I don't think Bush is redeemed in the black community going into the 2004 race. Now, the NAACP continues to play a role in situations like that, but I don't think that speaks to your heart as, let's use you as grassroots African-American woman in America today. I don't think that speaks to your heart or to your concern, your daily concerns about your existence and your opportunities, whether it's to go to school, to teach, to get a job, to feed your family, to live in a neighborhood, all that, in the way that the issues the NAACP was dealing with earlier in the century spoke to people's hearts. So I think there's a distance that occurs. I know people at the NAACP who say to me, when they get now the rush of people joining is when people are in their mid-30s. And they can identify it as the point at which these young people are working in a corporation where for the first time they feel the touch of racism, that somehow something has happened at the company and they didn't get the promotion or the opportunity, and now they want to become a lifetime member of the NAACP. Well, you can have a cynical view of that, But from my perspective, it suggests that when people have self-interest and see that the NAACP can serve a purpose for them, then they'll reach out to the NAACP. It's just like people are critical of Al Sharpton. But you know what, Al Sharpton serves a role in terms of, I think, the poor black and Hispanic community in New York City, because he raises a voice, he gets the media attention, he will lead the march, and all the rest. That serves a purpose. So if you serve people, then people will honor you, or people will support you. And I just think in this era, the NAACP is not as clear, and people are not as clear about what the NAACP's purpose might be.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could sort of fast forward just a little bit to the end of Thurgood Marshall's life. I know you talk about this a bit in the book, but if you could just sort of elaborate on it here today. I guess the relationship between Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas is the president.
Oh, this is a fascinating topic because it's one of the ongoing controversies. You know, Marshall was obviously upset watching the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings on TV. I was not with him, but people who were with him tell me that he was in tears at various times. And he felt it like, he felt it was a minstrel show. Like you had two black people, highly educated black people, attacking each other in public. It became like a soap opera. It was on TV every night. It got tremendous ratings if that's the way you want to look at it. But from Marshall's perspective, people were not paying attention to the idea that this guy at the time was in his 40s, that he could be on the court for 40 years. That you were putting in place a Supreme Court justice. And instead it became this evening entertainment thing with all this sex talk about Cuba kids on Coke cans and Long Dong Silver and all the rest. And he thought, how ridiculous, how stupid is this? And I think he took it as another, remember how I tell you how thin-skinned he was, he took it another way that people were saying, this guy is going to replace me. I mean, he didn't want anybody to replace him, but he certainly didn't think that it was going to be justified. Now you're going to have somebody who has been tarred in this way in public life, and that's supposed to be your next African-American Supreme Court justice. So he felt like the whole thing was a mess and a shame. There were people who were trying to persuade him to make a statement in opposition to Thomas at the time of the hearings, and that would have killed Thomas off, because Marshall had sufficient clout to do it at that time. If you recall, initially the NAACP and other groups are supportive of Thomas going into those hearings. So if Marshall had come out, even at the before or in the course of it, and said, this is the way I feel as the man who led Brown and all the rest, it would have gotten headlines.
And he did make sort of an oblique reference to Thomas, didn't he? I mean, there's some quote, I forget the exact quote.
Oh, I know what you're talking about.
The snake and
a black snake or a white snake.
Yeah.
It's not about Thomas.
Okay.
It's when he's retiring. Yeah, he's retiring. He makes a statement that his father told him. Reporters are asking him a question, and the question was, does it matter to you who replaces you if it's a black man or a white man? And his response was, my father taught me that a black snake or a white snake can bite you. So it's not necessarily the color of the person's skin. Right. So it wasn't specifically what about Clarence Thomas.
But the people applied it, I think.
Oh yeah, because look at Clarence Thomas's reputation in Black America is so low that people are always attacking. There's no shortage of that. But no, it wasn't about Thomas in specific. And then, so then Thomas is confirmed. And the minute Thomas is confirmed, that's when Marshall's retirement takes effect. He had not resigned from the court, he just retired, and therefore he was waiting for the next justice to come and replace him. And there's a tradition in which the new justice who comes on requests a cup of coffee or tea with the other sitting justices as a formality, nice to meet you, we'll be working together, first chance. But I make the request to come and visit you in your chambers. So Thomas makes the request of all the other justices, but he also makes the request of Thurgood Marshall, who by this time has moved from his chambers upstairs and is in a small office, but Marshall agrees to meet with Thomas. And as I said, it's normally a very small period of time, just have a cup of coffee, shake hands, like you meet your secretary, say hello to some of the clerks, that kind of thing. But with Marshall and Thomas, and I know this from talking with both of them, the meeting lasted almost 3 hours. And pretty much it was Marshall talking and Thomas listening, and Marshall going on about, you know, you can't bring your friends or your enemies to the court. It will damage the credibility of the court. You know, this court doesn't have any army to enforce its rulings. Its rulings are enforced by the faith of the American people and the idea that we are serious people and we give honest deliberation. That if you bring up people who supported you in your hearings or were opposed to you, it will damage that credibility for all time. That you have to view people on this court as intellectuals, as people who are trying to work through problems. You can't come up here and bring politics and start attacking people on a political basis. But most of the time, as I understand it, was dedicated to Marshall talking about his view of race in American law and taking him back over the period of the struggles to deal with plessy and the consequences that the way that American law had been used to disadvantage people of color in the society. And so that took place. And again, I heard from other justices that they were worried that after that meeting, that something might happen that would set off Thurgood Marshall, who, as I described him to you, was a cantankerous guy who could be set off. But he didn't get set off. He didn't say anything. You know, subsequently, you know, they would have events where the two of them would be at the court together, nothing like that. So, no, and of course they're not ideologically attuned in any way. But there was no personal way.